his knowledge of these living road signs. Okay. Now I'm going to turn the computer.
All right. Let me just get my bearings here. Okay, and now we need to get the presentation, right? I get this right here.
Or is it already up?
I think it's already up, right? Let's go to share screen.
Bringing up the screen.
We practiced this, so we're getting there. All right. Okay. How about that? I don't know who I can ask that would give me a thumbs up. We good?
Yep, we should be sharing the screen. Is that right, everybody?
It is up. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Okay.
You'll be able to ask questions on the side in the chat area. So if you have a question as it goes on, we're asking everybody to mute themselves so that Karl won't be interrupted as he goes. And go ahead, Karl.
Yeah. All right. And maybe, Sarah, if you find it meaningful to interrupt or just clarify, that's not going to be a problem. I only got about maybe 30 to 35 slides. It might be about a half hour-ish, but hopefully it'll be thorough and it will be helpful. So the picture here on this slide is just of Al and Judy Mesner in front of one of their trail marker trees in Fond du Lac County in the center of the state. Okay, so we'll go back to that later. The presentation overall has about 7 trail marker trees, and that I think potentially could be one, with hopefully more to find in the area. All right. Okay. So first off, myself, I'm born in Ashford, born and raised in Ashford, and I've been teaching U.S. history for about 15 years, but I also teach psychology, philosophy. I have a class called See America First, which is based on traveling. So in that context, understand that when I analyze something or if I share something, I feel like it's very important to look at it from all stakes of the social studies, not just documenting it with history, but understanding the thought behind it, which is philosophy, and also the psychology of it. So all of that is very important. I got my teaching degree at UW Oshkosh, then I got my master's. I thought I would want to be a principal. Later on, maybe I'd want to be a superintendent of a school, but that is my leadership degree. And then my dissertation was other publications, which are over here. In the next slide, these are some of the books that I wrote. Just waiting for it to turn, sorry.
Did I go up?
I'm just looking for it to turn. I don't know why. Okay. All right. So I used to write a lot more about politics. The nice thing is it honed my research skills, but now I'm pretty much local history. So in general, after I got my doctorate, I got into local history writing along the topics of like just anything, particularly farming, and the way the land used to be. Then about 3 years ago, I started getting into this theme of what was lost, what has changed with the landscape. So that's pre-settler, and trying to examine some of those. This is an example here. I've written so far about 18 articles that have been published. Once I get to about 30, we'll probably put them in a book. But in general, the topics of the What Was Lost series is basically last Native Americans in the area. You know, my friends and acquaintances that are over 90 years old and the links that they have, trying to interview people who are in their last stages of life, but heard stories from their grandparents. In general, in regard to Wisconsin and this area that I'm talking about today, Indians were removed probably in the 1850 to 1910 time period, but that is very sketchy because it depends on how tolerant the farmer was. Okay, so but these are some of the topics on in the What Was Lost series. I do want to just remind you that, you know, history, I think people make a mistake that they think it's true. I do believe, to the best that I have done, that what I present is accurate and true, but it is also subjective. So I think sometimes people come from an aspect that because something is written, it must be true, and that's not how I necessarily look at it. But in my case, I do tape record interviews. I'm always willing to sit down with others to take recommendations. but that does take a lot of time. And sometimes, you know, when I do interviews with people, that doesn't necessarily equate with a story or something actually written till 5-10 years down the road when the timing is right. But just remember that, you know, history is argumentative. I think sometimes when people say stuff, we assume that that is fact. I have started my research with people that I trusted, and then those people who they trusted, and those are the recommendations. So if I did not think that the person was credible, then I didn't waste my time interviewing them. So, you know, it's just to the best of my ability, but that's just kind of where I come from as a historian. Let me see here. Okay, so the first slide that I have here is just, this is a good example of what I call number one in the presentation. This is in the eastern third of Fond du Lac County. So this is this would roughly be between Milwaukee and Green Bay. I think that's a fair assessment.
Sure.
Roughly halfway for those who are farther away. So this is roughly where this tree would be. For purposes of most of the presentation today, most of the trees aren't specifically labeled out of respect that, you know, out of the landowner, and also just that they not be, I think the crowd we're talking to would respect the trees, but we do want to make sure that they last. That is a tough line though. I just want to clarify because we do want to find out where they are so we can map them. So I hope that that's a fair balance, but maybe I'll lead to other questions later that I can clarify. In terms of why are we talking about trees, number one, it honors the previous people in the area, primarily before settlement. Also, I do think they lead to significant sites, including settlements, or they will validate areas. The third bullet there, in general, I do think the amount of trees that we are finding without relatively even looking for them yet, or having a mass advertising to find them, is starting to suggest the importance of this area, which is south of Lake Winnebago, but in this eastern third to central part of Fond du Lac County. So I just understand, like, I know some of you might be thinking like, well, this is just local, but that is not how I necessarily look at it. I would say that this has national significance in terms of history, particularly before Wisconsin statehood. Also notice that, you know, these trees were already vanishing with the publications in the 1940s, 1920s, particularly Jansen, who I like to cite here, and is mentioned in later slides. So what we have left is really probably just 5 to 10% of the trees that were existing. But if we can find them, you could probably do you could multiply them by a lot. How much is hard to say, and that's how many trees you would have in the county. So for example, today I am showing you 7 without really looking at 1/3 of the county and not really even advertising most of these trees. But I do think it's a fair assessment. Like, for example, in Fond du Lac County alone, in 1800, there was probably somewhere between 200 and 500 trees that were marked. I know that may seem high, but Jansen's research indicates that in some cases they were only 200 yards apart, especially as the forest got thicker. And as well as probably as you're getting more to a significant meeting place, which I would argue this county was. All right, but we're running out of time to mark them, and that's why I'm trying to, you know, get acquainted with where they are, and maybe we can find more. Okay. So why were trees chosen when natives bent them? Well, of course, they're readily available. And please understand that trees can be easily contorted at the right time. So in that case, you know, when we look at that, let me just, I'm just going to, thanks. Okay. All right. Okay. I had all 4 pictures showing. I just wanted to make sure I could read my sides clearly. Okay, so why were trees chosen? Besides being readily available, please understand, like the quote here with Jansen on the bottom here, the second to the one, the tree markers can be hidden or obvious depending on what the natives wanted. So as Jansen basically an excellent researcher out of Illinois in the 1940s. This is from the Scientific Monthly. He said, quote, by using a few trees out of many, the Indians could make these markers as conspicuous or as inconspicuous as desired. Hence, trees made ideal guideposts. He also, in the same publication, noticed that, please remember that observation has taught these primitive people that trees do not heighten in mass nor turn on its axis. So once you've got the tree to bend the way you want to, it will not really change its form. You may have to trim branches, but the ones that you have bent are not going to lower and they're not going to heighten. They will just grow, okay? So that's very important. And obviously people working with the environment would have known that for years, if not thousands of years. Next one. I think in general too, we're never really going to know what every trail marker tree points to, but these seem to be a legitimate list here. Number one, an old village or a settlement, burials or mounds, springs, which is fresh water. I believe Dennis Downs' book makes a note too that usually animals go to easy water. So in general, that could be substantially maybe more filled with animal feces, things like that. So secret springs might be marked as well. You also have the aspect that fresh water coming from underneath were considered sacred spots by many people. So in that context, the springs are very important. Some of these trees might also mark where quarries are, where Indians could get stones and then make their arrowheads. Council meeting locations is another one. Also, whether or not they were, storing, arrowheads, or which we did have one in Oakfield actually, where someone admitted they found 5 unused arrowheads found in one spot. Also, rock stones. All types of Native American stones that might have been manipulated to be tools, which I know I've seen at the Cahokia Museum where they found one. Can't remember the state. So it's plausible that a tree would mark that, not that the cache would be right by it, but from that tree you would be able to walk a few hundred yards, maybe just 10, 10 yards, maybe even at some other discrete location next to it, that's where your, cache is. Then we got petriforms, medicine wheels, and caves. Now I would say largely this list here, these are all in Fond du Lac County. So it's plausible. So when we look at, the, let me see if let me get this right. So when we look at the trees and the age around here, remember you're from different states, the timing of Native American removal is different, but in Wisconsin, the trees around here that are bent really should be about 150 to 170 years old. We have with Indian removal, that's Jackson and President Jackson, our 7th, and that's in 1830. Wisconsin's Indian removal and Minnesota really starts to heat up by 1850. You got the Sandy Lake tragedy with the Ojibwe, where they were ripped off by the territorial governor of Minnesota, kind of trapped, and then they starved to death. So really, unfortunately, when a lot of people teach U.S. history, it's kind of like, oh, the Cherokee were moved to Oklahoma, and yet in reality, those laws of Indian removal are not just that era, it continues decades after. We do have weird issues, though, of whether or not trees could have been more recently bent. Like, for example, it would be plausible that they might only be 130 years old. For example, I just noticed, I just cited here just quicker, the story of Washington County, which is the county underneath Fond du Lac. And that is that Indians squatted, thank you, and Indians may, in some cases, Quicker's research indicated that farmers were happy or at least tolerated Indians on their land. They were in the woods, they weren't in the field. Maybe they learned a few things from them. Some of that even goes back a little later. I mean, I have a rare exception in Fond du Lac County where I know a woman who's 98 who was a preemie, and then she was put in a dresser in 1925 to stay warm in winter because she was only 2 pounds. But Indians came to help their grandmother, the grandmother of this baby, because she was allied with them, but that was also very quiet and not a norm. So now that is a rare exception. I would say 1925 is late. I think for most Indians, they got out of here by 1910 because the farmers had flipped their positions on it and they just were uncomfortable with it by majority. But there are rare exceptions, okay? So just understand. I also made a note of a longhouse. There's a story of us, of some of the elders in this area where they noticed that their farm actually had a longhouse. That is how they defined it. I think it's probably much more plausible that it was a sack or fox elm bark house based on where it was, which was near a river. But either way, that is an 1865 to 1885 story, hard to date exactly because it's based off of a man who's 90 and his great grandfather. Okay, but that gives you some idea of when these trees would have had to been bent, particularly if these are using the first picture I showed you, which would be the elbow look. Okay, so like I said, I think pretty much there's two really good sources. One is Jansen, who published a really beautiful 8-page piece in Scientific Monthly. To be honest with you, I just looked at Wikipedia and I found it and I cited it. So then I went to eBay and I bought the edition. So Wiki on trail marker trees has a beautiful picture of the Indiana trail marker tree, which is just gorgeous and has this classic elbow bend that you kind of see down here, where the more modern book of Dennis Downs, published in where my cursor is was published in 2011. Now I talked to Dennis pre-COVID, and I had sent him some pictures, and then from there I actually got his book. Please note, I know we're kind of preaching to the choir here, but I gather a lot of you would be serious about learning this stuff. That book is like somewhere between $80 and $110 to get, but I do believe it is well worth it. If you reach out to Dennis Downs, he might even give you a signed copy. That's what he did for me. I just mailed him a check. It's an awesome book. Some of the people that I've told that I have in this upcoming slides, the landowners, I was like, you could really use this book. It just envisions so much. It widens the area and the range. And Dennis Down has done thorough research. Notice the cover, though. The cover here on this book, Native American Trail Marker Trees, and then the subtitle is Making Paths Through the Wilderness. That book, he is an artist, so he's also done sculptures. So, for example, Dennis, I think, really fully validates the Great Lakes region, particularly the turnaround in the Chicago area of going around Lake Michigan as a trail post. What I'm trying to do, though, is try to point out that this in Fond du Lac County would have also been connected to that and was a major hub, which clearly had to be the case as the Northwest Territories were being destroyed and Native Americans were being exterminated and the forests were going to the wayside. Okay, so, but the big thing here is you want to look for this knob. So when you bend this tree, you try to often create an angle, okay? So there are two sketches that I can provide you. Number one, let me just, looking for the order here. Okay, sorry, just at my slides, okay? So this is, there's the next three slides are on the knob, okay? And how you would create this. So first of all, this is like the most beautiful tree I've seen yet in the county, where there is no debate that this is a Native American trail marker tree, okay? Now, if you follow my cursor, the length and the height of this split is about 7 feet. I do need to remeasure it. It might be longer. It then comes over on this angle at another 7 feet. And where the knob is, and before the two branches come out, that is about a yard. It is a large, it's very hard to say how old this tree is. The landowner, and I'm sorry that I'm not quoting the book that he was reading, this sits in what would have been, when this was living, an old growth maple forest. And there are some arborists that do claim that in old growth forest, maples don't shoot up right away. So let's say you might have a 3-foot maple or a 1-foot maple in the woods that honestly for 10 to 20 to 25 years may just sit there and it waits for the tree to fall. if that is the context, I'm pretty sure this tree is probably 350, even though it's a maple. It certainly is 250. And I think it's bent at the right time. It also is surrounded by other trees that are questionable, including one or two that are in this presentation, okay? But this is the elbow and the knob that we're looking for. And the best example with that, this is Jansen's drawing, okay? Now, Jansen makes the argument that if you look at item number B, okay, so we take a sapling, probably is somewhere between 5 and 10 feet tall, depends on the species. Jansen made an argument in this drawing that they would have taken a leather strap that bends that. I'm not saying that never happened. I just want you to realize, I mean, I'm pretty sensitive with my trees and I plant them a lot. I would never do that because that would cut into the bark. But also that makes it susceptible to disease. But we also do have to understand 400 years ago, I think disease was on the last bit of the mind, and we didn't have the problems from this one Pangea going back to Pangea, like because everything is interrelated in 2022, there are so many species that makes trees susceptible to disease. You would not have had that issue, and that may not have even been a concern. But I'm just saying, if you strap this rawhide to this tree, that would create some considerable pressure. I have seen Dennis Downs in his book. He argues like you could have taken a bag of weights and tied it around here on B and then have it hang down, and that would help as well. Okay, now as it gets going, you will notice that two new leaders form. This was the original leader on item C that is laying parallel to the ground. That will atrophy in time. So by picture D, it's kind of dying, and then it becomes a healed knob, okay? I drew this one so I could use it for my publications. I used an example where you either would have tied it down to a rock with vines, or you could have weighted it. You know, there's so many ways you could have done it, okay? But this here, you know, you're going to have multiple leaders form, probably like 3 or 4 or 5 as the tree is bent. So, you know, it had 1 leader. Now it has, as it's bent in picture 3 here, it has 4. Then the Indians over repetitive years, probably somewhere between 5 and 15, would occasionally come back and then start trimming how many they want. There are 3s. There are some with 3. I'm sure there's more. I think the one that I showed you back here, this one, it's plausible. Really, this was the intention and this was an accident, or this was in time. So as Indians were removed from the area, this may have been intentional, this side one, or it's just a distractor that was never pruned because Indians had left the area. Okay, so but this is in general what you're looking for. This is like what I would call the money shot. This is like hands down, unless it's like a box elder or a quick growing tree, this is really leads to pause if you see trees like this in the forest. Here where my cursor is the healed knob. You look for that, okay? So how do you bend the tree? Just again, no answer's wrong. We weren't there, but you could weight it with a rock, okay? Perhaps down on the edge of the leader. You could also, by the way, you could also use a dead log if you look at the last bullet. So in general, if you know, you just put a tree and cut it down and put it on a 20-foot tree that's, again, I grew up around maple wood. So like a true maple grows competitively with other maples. And so, you know, you're talking about a maple with a 4-foot, that's the one you wouldn't be able to bend, but, you know, a 4-inch diameter, that tree's probably 25 to 30 years old. So we had tons of trees that really were, and my brother had spaded some out in where we grew up. The maples grow really tall and really thin. All you got to do is put a log on them and bend them over, and they will, you know, start to create that arch. So they may have used logs. Some people also argue they used ground piles. So when you bury the leader, you actually just put ground on it, which I think would work. This probably explains why some of them re-rooted, okay? Then we have vines, okay? Our area of Fond du Lac County has a lot of wild grapevines. That works too. I was going to experiment that with myself just to see how that turns out. Downs has done a lot of remaking of trees, which I recommend people doing out of respect to Native American spiritualism. So, and you can stake too. That would work as well. Okay, and then I sketched this, I hope this helps. There's a lot of ways that they can look, okay? Now, I've talked about the elbow, which is probably number 1, and also number 2 and 3. Those are variations of the elbow, okay? Please notice number 5, that's taking the advantage of one branch. So if the tree is too old to bend, probably already in its 20s or 15 to 20 years old, you will just take one branch and bend it down. That will unnaturally, it will actually, well, naturally it comes back, but you can tell this type of bend in number 5 is not normal. That would have been intentional. You would have taken an older tree, tied its branch down, and then the branch would work its way back north, up, I should say. 4 is an example too of probably rerooting. Okay, so 4 here is an example of rerooting. Sometimes too, though, the branch does kind of live a while in number 6 because it did not atrophy and die and shrivel up, which again probably takes somewhere between 40 and 80 years if you're talking about an oak. But it all, again, depends on the tree. I put number 7. It's not as parallel. I ran out of space on my sketch pad. But in general, number 7 is an example of what Downs argued was a boundary marker. He seems to do that with a walnut-based tree or something that had a lot of leaves on one leaf. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's walnut. Black walnuts grow by us in this county, and that's where I would try that with that tree. If you cut the top off of a walnut, you probably could reconfigure and bend because walnuts grow very, very parallel with their branches, and that would be a good one to do. He argued number 7 was a type of boundary marker. Okay, now those are the down style. Okay, but for here on this slide, I do want to point out there were different trees that were kind of like the number 5 on this. This is kind of what we're focusing on here, this different style bend. So, you know, all of these are related to bending the leader with the exception of number 5 and number 7, okay? But 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 on here are all about bending the leader over the top of the tree and bending it down. But number 7 is bending the sides and probably maybe even potentially cutting off the top, or you could maybe bend the leader and then once it creates another one, bend that one. But 5 is a whole different game, and that's kind of what we have over here in Oakfield. So if I elaborate on like number 5, I like to call it the guard bend because Robert E. Guard had really good books on Wisconsin history published 50 to 60 years ago. And in that book, there was a tree that looked like this, which I resketched, okay? And it was on the south end of the Horicon Marsh. And in general, what you want to notice on this sketch, I intentionally darkened the branches that were probably bent down. It kind of looks like, for those of you who are fans of The Wizard of Oz, the talking trees in The Wizard of Oz. Okay, so their arms are like moving around, but they're pointing. This tree no longer exists, okay? But please notice here with this bullet here where my cursor is, don't touch, you really don't touch the leader because the tree is too old to create the elbow in the, you know, the way the original leader was bent, okay? So, sorry, I'm reading that. I do want to apologize if there were errors that I did try to correct beforehand, and I don't know when I switched this to Google Slides, so just my apologies with that. But like, there are sometimes I just don't catch it, but I don't think I got the most modern version of this. But I do just want to stress here that this is just a rough sketch, but I made the arrows here to just kind of point out when you look at a tree like this that is bent, the pulling of the arm down seems to create a little bit more scarring. So now, again, that's hard because this tree no longer exists. It has died. And I don't know if it was destroyed, but I think it just died. But I just know that it does not exist anymore. I don't know what its final ending was. But these darkened branches here, especially connected to this trunk, is quite bent down and also had somewhat scarring. This is the tree that is still standing, and it's both in the Horicon Marsh. So like the Karsten tree, this Mesner tree, which still stands, is almost pointing open, kind of like, I'm imagining like to some extent like Jesus in down south, that statue in South America, in Brazil. In Brazil. So it's up standing and it's pointing this way. Please note that this does not have a large competitive tree to the east of it. So like when you study this tree, it doesn't have branches going on the other side of, they're all pointing on one half side of the tree, which, I think is a telltale. There are people that were really respective of Native American history, knew the woods as well. There's at least 4 people, many of them who are now gone, that were convinced it was a trail marker tree. It has a lot of weird scarring and knobs. So I still think that on this side, you can't see it. But on the other side of this tree, if I was standing on the other side, you would see more scarring where there probably were other branches. The age matches, this tree is probably, at least 200, 250. The landowner thinks that the same thing. And looking at some arboretum mathematics, it seems to match up with that. It's also at a place close by where the deer would drop from the ledge rock of the Niagara Escarpment, which is what Oakfield is famous for, to the Horicon Marsh, which is flat. So it's in that vicinity where that would have been where Indians had crossed, okay? This is another example of the scarring here. Like this is probably an atrophied branch potentially. If this tree is 250 years old and this tree was pulled down, if this branch was pulled down where Al and Judy are pictured here, the owners, it probably died because it didn't get enough sun, and or it had changed. Now the other thing too is you might be able to tell it more in the green picture over here. When you stand on the east side of the tree and look to where it's pointing, which it points exactly to Horicon Marsh to the south and to the east, which would make sense because this is on the northern end. It points to the south and to the west, It points to the south and to the west, and the tree is on the east side, the north and east side of the Horicon Marsh. But the point is that if you stand behind it, you'll also notice that there's like another branch that is almost bent the same way. So that is one that I think is a little different, that the landowners and other people are pretty conclusive. I like the picture of this because the woods today in the trail runs well with what the landowner thinks was the old trail in the woods. So you got like 3 different types of trees here, okay? You've got Native American trees that were bent by their leader and bent over. You have trees that were probably just their branches were bent to turn. And then I do want to point out this tree is dead in Fond du Lac County now too. It's been gone about 20 years, I believe, but Ripon signal oak, most people concluded that this was a Native American beacon tree. So it wasn't bent, but when you could see it from far away, you knew where you were on the way between like Green Lake and Oshkosh. Not that that's what they called it back then, but that tree was so distinct that that was a beacon. And that's according to the book, Every Tree Anchor. So that's, you can get a picture of that in that book if you'd like. If you really like trees, it's a wonderful book on trees in Wisconsin. Just a question that I have is, were trail marker trees more likely to be oaks on the western half of Fond du Lac County? Maybe or maybe not. They seem to be oaks in the Horicon Marsh, but that might be just because that's all that was available besides like willows, which you're not going to use because it's too much of a softwood and the tree doesn't last long. Okay. Here's a curious potential guard bend tree. Now this is near the first tree that I showed you that was the beautiful elbow. So this is a curious tree where, like, again, I am not seeing this as a trail marker tree. That being said, it points west to the ledge, but this sticks out 2 feet. Yeah, and I have not seen that commonly in the forest. So like, I don't know if this is like a type of tree, like number one, it's got a weird twist and the other trees around there are all straight. But I don't think this is enough to consider a trail marker with this bend, but we have this weird knob here that sticks out 2 feet and it's very, very firm and crisp, probably suggesting that the branch came out this way. Again, nothing that I could conclude, but I just want to let you know, like, of the 7 that I picked, there are ones that I have rejected that aren't in this presentation or is like on this pile. This is another one, third tree. This is a cool example. This one is in the east flipped, okay? So this is not a perfect bend, but I like this tree because number one, it has strong spiritual connections with people who identify with Native American spiritualism. And and the other thing is that it's an ash tree. So I think it's proof that they weren't good trees to bend, but I also think it validates that the marker needed to be here based on what spiritual connections are to the tree. So in general, I don't see ash being used a lot in the Jansen book or Downs. I'm not saying they're not. When I had told Downs that I had, an ash tree that we were looking at, he said, "Oh, that makes sense because it's a hardwood." And I think so too. But I would also point out that it's plausible that this is actually good proof that Indians probably did not want to use them much because ash is very straight grain. So once you create the bend, I am wondering if it actually creates a split. Please note that this is probably about an 8 or 9 foot circumference, which isn't a lot, but please note that this is growing in borderline wetlands, but it is in an area where ash trees grow plentiful. And so I am confident that it is a broken tree that is a trail marker. And to be quite honest with you, I think it just lasted long enough to be seen. But that's an example. So those are 3 that I'm confident, 1, 2, and 3. Here's another one. This is very close to a coworker of mine, and this is in the middle third of Fond du Lac County. This at least tells you how it works. This is a good example of the tree. It's about 10 foot in circumference. It is probably a silver maple, but I haven't seen the leaves in spring yet. Okay, it shows you a good way of how it recovers when you bend it, but this could be natural, but it doesn't have a natural leader. And this does point to the ledge and into the vicinity of where tree number 2, the messenger tree, is. So it's correctly twisted and contorted. And it has no evidence that the top actually was cut off. Again, we're getting into other ones here, so I'm not saying these are for sure, but these are things you're looking for where if you're hiking in the woods, I would recommend that you pause and take a look at it and really examine them, but they're ones that we can learn from. But I do think it's quite plausible. This is a better image that shows you size comparison, very close to the road. But again, bends over, and this bend points this way. And again, this one, I'm not saying point something. It is an example of recovery that it had to replace its leader. But again, this is a 90-degree bend where my cursor is, and the bend of this tree points to the ledge. Plausible, all right? This one is a cool one. I just got this on a whim. I was touring some land for another book I was working on, and right on the top of the hill, this is the eastern third of Wisconsin, Fond du Lac County, and this could be a doubler. Number one, you want to see the different angle of where my cursor is. This is a 90-degree bend, and this was atrophied, although I do think the landowner may have cut this because it was in the way or whatever. I can't remember looking at it, and I didn't get a close-up, but I do believe it was cut. But that doesn't change the fact because it grew the right way. I also want to point out sometimes 2 trees may have been bent over, so this may have been a double pointer. Here's another image here. This is better. So I am sorry that I did not get the species. I know it looks like sugar maple here, but I do not think those are the leaves from that tree. So I don't want to misspeak. But this arch, and this is the tricky thing with these trail marker trees. You need to be able to understand that once you stress the tree or it's in shade, it's hard to say how long that took. I know that, like this is probably about 1.5 feet wide here. But how much that is, it's hard to say. But again, you also have this bent this way. It does match though. I mean, there's mounds everywhere there. Okay. So, there's probably at least 10 mounds for sure that I'm aware of without even doing a mound study in that township alone where that's at. And that's, yeah.
You mean burial mounds?
Well, it's always hard to say whether or not they're effigies or burial, but they are mounds. And because, obviously I don't support digging them up, but either way, I still think that they're sacred. And that's just mounds. That's not including the quarries. You got to remember, Wisconsin, Fond du Lac County has a lot of quarries, and logically speaking, you probably wouldn't note a quarry until you saw an opening of the earth where Indians had quarried. So like when you get into the town of Eden, town of Ashford, town of Oakfield, these are very, very significant quarry sites to the state of Wisconsin as well as this area. Well, you wouldn't know those were quarries until those were opened. A lot of our churches too, you know, going back, were made from local quarries, but in reality probably would have been open places of earth that Native Americans had gone there for years. I like this tree. I have a good feeling on it, but you know, again, need to get back again. But again, eastern third of Fond du Lac County. Which species are better? I just want to point out, like, oaks and elms and hickories, but of course a lot of elms have died with the Dutch elm disease. Maples don't last as long as oaks, so I think, again, most people think that these trees should be oaks and hickories and longer growing trees. I have a friend of mine who went out to the Dakotas. He talked about the cottonwoods a lot, so does Downs. Red oaks, sycamores, although again, if you would bend a sycamore today, just be careful. Sycamores are notorious for actually hollowing out. But again, I don't think Indians, when they bent them, thought that their culture was going to be annihilated. And so in general, to be fair, I think you would have maybe, heck, you might have even still used box elder, which bends so easily and naturally grows like this. But I don't think, you know, sycamores nowadays are kind of known for eventually hollowing out. Here are some other disqualifiers to consider. Remember, just because of box elders grow so quick, maybe for some of you call it the Manitoba maple, but around here, you know, the joke is like it's here today and firewood tomorrow. They grow so quick, so that's not a real one. I also want to show you, like, this is one we found in the forest near one of these trail marker trees. Like, this just naturally happened. It had to have, because this is pre, and he said, well, you know, the lumber companies came through here and a tree must have fell on it. Here's an example too of modern day. Like, this is just how this could happen. This is also how you could do this naturally with a Native American. You're never going to be able to tell for sure that it was done intentionally or unintentionally by a Native American, but this is an example today. I just took those modern ones just so you can see how a tree grows. Here are lastly, some open questions. What is the impact of slowed growth? You can't, I would argue you can't use a typical tree age calculation on trees that probably were stunted, okay? Sorry for the error there with threes, okay? But if they were stunted, how long has bending been going on? I don't know, you know, probably obviously 500 to 600 years, but does this go back to 1,000 or 2,000 years ago? And when did the first Native Americans bend trees? What are the youngest, most recent bends, and what are the oldest? Again, we don't really want to drill into the tree and do a test of that, but probably studying them after they've collapsed would be worthy of that. But, you know, again, there's always going to be some probably 10 to 100-year difference on what two arborists could claim a tree is, okay? And also, it's possible natives were bending trees late. You know, if that was part of their heritage and they wanted to mark something, you would probably still do that as long as you can, including if you were squatting on someone's farmland. Also pay attention, Jansen as well as Downs seem to indicate that conifers weren't used. They're more in the high altitudes, high latitudes, and you wouldn't be able to see the marker as clear. And you probably would have had to trim if you wanted to use them. So most people argue evergreens weren't, but that being said, white cedars is still interesting, okay? So just as a review, these are my best plausible examples. Many of them are in the eastern third of Fond du Lac County, but we haven't looked in the western third. So we even have one in number 7 that I don't have a picture of where a highway was actually diverted. So, and I have driven by that, but I have not checked it out yet. But I was told that a highway was diverted. That highway is diverted, and that was 20 years ago, and it does explain an unnatural bend that you would do in a large highway. So 175. So on that note, you know, just these are still other ones too. You know, I didn't draw. Downs has an interesting one in that book where he talks about it as a portage, that they would fuse in some areas of the continent, including I think Canada. They would fuse two trees together. This maple really is intriguing because it is so unnatural how that would happen. And I do believe that this might be a tree that significantly validates that the area where tree number 1 is not just a trail marker tree, but it is a lot more special than that. So again, this is one I didn't put on the pile, but very strange, 200 to 300-year-old tree. And I don't know how you can bend that at the top. That's so hard to do unless there was some tying. And vines are aplenty in this portion of the county, if left to its natural growth. Also, some final thoughts. I gave this first presentation to the Oakfield Ledge area, which rides up to the shores of Winnebago, Lake Winnebago, on the east side of the county. So who is left in the ledge area that we should interview? Should we be bending trees to honor the past? I would recommend that. I'm trying to start to do that this spring. I just think it's neat to study these trees, to learn that, and I applaud Dennis Downs for doing that. I think that'd be a legacy he's left. Not only with his writings, but actually bending trees. Please keep an eye out in the forest and respect those before us. And I do know that I've written a lot about what was lost, but I think we should also understand there is still a lot that we can save if we get the education out there. And then lastly, there's two, I skipped the third bullet. What number of trail marker trees would appease critics that this area was significant to the US history? Even if I would argue, even if half of the trees that I presented today and numbered 1 through 7 were legit, I would say that's a pretty nice start. I do have a feeling, though, we should be able to find 10 to 20. And if that many are remaining, that would start to prove the plausibility that there were probably 200 to 500 in this county-wide region to get to this side in the 1800s. And I do believe that is a plausible argument. And lastly, the last bullet is, there is a spirit in the tree. Humans might live 80 to 90 years. These living creatures are often 3 times as old or older. They know the history of the land and respect them. There's a reason they have survived, and maybe it's so you will find them. So on that note, I guess I'll turn it over to Sarah.
And perhaps it's Lou that'll be taking over.
Oh, yes, that's right. Stop share. Should I stop share?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, Lou, we can.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you, Karl, very much. That was enlightening. It was interesting. It opened my eyes, and I really appreciate all your work on this. It's terrific. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
For those of you who may have questions for Karl, the best way that we've found to do this is if you can find on your Zoom screen, down in the middle at the bottom, there should be a title bar down there that says chat. And if you click on that, that'll pop up a screen that you can type any questions you may have into that a little box there. And make sure that you click on the menu bar that's, once it opens, that says to, there's a colon, and then there's a list of various options. And the best one would be for everyone so that we can all see what questions are being asked. We found that that's the best way to do this, rather than just allowing people to talk, because they talk over each other. So if you do have any questions for Karl, if you can stick around for a little while, I hope you can.
Yeah. Oh, I'm good. I'm good. Yep.
Good.
So if there's any questions, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Okay, great.
I have a question before someone starts typing. Karl, I'm convinced that there were tree markers out west with Lewis and Clark traveling along the Missouri River. They must have come across some of these type of trees. What do you think?
You would think so, but I don't know with the later marks of those trails, because they're in high altitudes. And I just find it odd that they would not have written about them. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So I don't know. I know Dennis has chapters on Texas trail marker trees. I know he went into Canada. I don't know though if they extend into the Rockies, which is a good question. I'm not saying no. I didn't have a chance. Dennis's book is pretty extensive, and I read the first 80 to 100 pages, and he starts chunking it by states. You would think so. A friend of mine who hunts out in the Dakotas said that he saw cottonwoods that were bent. And cottonwoods are a really nice tree because they grow quick. They're relatively strong wood, even though they grow fast. The Siouxland poplar, which is a hybrid tree, which is amazing, grows about 6 to 10 feet in a year. But like that's a wonderful tree that's remarkably resilient towards wind. So, I think cottonwoods are a good fit. So, I mean, but I think it's a logical question, but I find it odd that and I have never read the Lewis and Clark journals in full, but it seems that given that so many of those men wrote that, I don't know if they do mention trail marker trees. You would think they would, but of course they're following the Missouri. So up until you follow the Missouri all the way to the Mandan, really, they're not using they would not have used trail marker trees.
They're not traveling by land, yeah.
Yeah, so they're not really, this is rusty. I mean, I always show my students the Lewis and Clark PBS special, which I think is probably one of Ken Burns' best documentaries, even though it's old. But I think even north of the Mandan, right? Don't they still follow river? So they really, you're really not until the late parts of that journey, when you're going over the Bitterroot Mountains and things like that. But at that point, I don't know. I would assume they trusted the natives. And I don't know if the natives would have needed trail marker trees because they would have known the land so well. And some of those tribes, and I'm just talking out loud, I'm not saying this is accurate, but I just remember, I don't know if they were talking about the Nez Perce or the Shoshone. In that documentary, there's a very weak tribe that was very scared and timid and did not have guns. And I don't know if it was the Hidatsa. There's a scene where it's like or something. It's a scene later, I think disc 2, but they were so timid and isolated, I don't think they would have bent trees, So, but that being said, maybe they did, and we just, Lewis and Clark just didn't bump into them. But I do think it must be bent mostly. But again, as you get into evergreens, I don't know if that's as efficient.
Right.
So, okay. Okay, so let me go through these questions. Do you have trail maps that give you an idea where to look for trail marker trees? I don't. I do want to clarify too, though. I don't think Dennis probably has a private one, but I don't think he would publish that because he doesn't want these trees ruined. There's a beautiful one on Wikipedia that's huge, probably a 350-year-old tree in Indiana. It has the perfect arch bend. And I don't know where that's located, but I know that it's the vicinity you eventually kind of figure out. But I am trying to get a trail marker map out. But again, I would be honest with you too. I don't know when I would release that. I probably wouldn't until I was about to die. I'd like to give these trees the time to live, because there's always somebody who could destroy them. Okay, so that's why I have 7 trees, but one's pretty public, but the landowner was very public about it for years, and he's proud of it, and I think he should be. So in regard to trail maps, I don't know. And even there is some trail maps though of the Highland Park area in Dennis Downs that, because they were so old, there would be some to show you around that Chicago vicinity, and some might be standing that you could see. So that'd be a place. My dream is to see the one in Indiana. I just don't know where it is, and I don't know where I would go to see that, but that's on private land. Have you looked at the original U.S. Surveyor notebooks to find trails they recorded? I did not, and I just largely got to remember my history starts from the landowners here. And I do want to stress, my desire is nothing national. My desire is, I feel like I have enough people, in regard to Michael's question, locally, that I have enough to write the rest of my life. I don't find it valuable to write at national levels about presidents and things like that. So understand, for surveyor notebooks, we have access to the 1862 plat map that they made for Wisconsin. I'm hoping that I will run into other people locally, but Michael has a really great question. It's just note that my bias is that I'm not really interested in other places, because I know the land here, and that's what I can write about best. So, and don't take that any disrespect. It's just, I just feel like, when you know people, you could trust them, and you know that the story is honest. And even if I can just give my time to this area, and validated as important, because I think some people who did know its importance died too young. They were good landowners and caretakers, or they just didn't quite fully see the full picture. And that's okay, because, we all come from different perspectives. So it's a good question, Michael. So thank you. But I will make a note of that because I think it'll be helpful. And we were talking before about talking to a map person, but just understand my specialty is just this county. Okay. With really no desire to move on. And I probably will stay here my whole life. So have you looked at all in other counties such as Washington and Ozaki? No, I have not. James had a good question there at 10:59. Have you looked at all other counties? I've heard of some, but no, I have not. I'm assuming they are there. Okay. And I do believe they are, just because the mounds are there as well. But we do have to understand for more broader viewers of this presentation that are not from Wisconsin, as you get closer to Milwaukee, most of that land has been developed. So there are some weird pockets in Fond du Lac. We have a lot of farm fields all the way up to probably, you have more roots in, some of the, ties to Shawano and like the Menominee Reservation when you get up there, but there's so much farmland. Like, I guess in regard to like James' comments, I have not looked at other counties in depth, although I'm pretty close to the Washington County line. Because again, I start with people that I trust and then I work out. So, but I always kind of give an analogy. If you could have seen Fond du Lac County as a 2000 puzzle piece, you would have had all those pieces, about 2,000 pieces of freshwater springs, undisturbed mounds 200 years ago, petroforms, a ton of petroforms in this county that largely have been destroyed. That's all missing, and quarries. One thing I ran out of time to explain is that there were quarries, I believe, in this vicinity that were intentionally destroyed. Indians went to caves. They were safe. They were places of neutrality, sometimes in times of need or like when the weather was bad. But there seems to be some suggestions in portions of the county that actually settlers destroyed the caves and destroyed the quarries, which sometimes work in and of itself, because a quarry and a cave are together, because you're quarrying in and then you keep the cave, but those were intentionally destroyed. And I have seen places where there is so much flint that clearly it's coming from a big exposed rock location, not just like, hey, this is where people sat down at the campfire and made some arrowheads. So in that context, trying to show that as well, okay? Lou, again, the 1103 question, that would be perhaps trail trees were how the Lemhi Shoshone guide Old Toby was able to stay on the Loho Trail. The guide knew to look, but he didn't point them to Lewis and Clark. Yeah, so I couldn't speak for that, but thank you for that. That's getting out of my, I'm not a Lewis and Clark expert, so I just, but I didn't mean to misspeak, so hopefully, but I do think it's interesting, like, where do where do the trail marker trees end? That's probably a better question for Dennis, but again, Dennis is legitimately guarded. So I just, Dennis has made, has done so much work, even his book there's only like 500 of them. That's why, like, I've never understood why people don't have an interest in it. I just kind of connected with trees and I always liked it. Some Native Americans and Native American spiritualists pointed me out to Dennis, and he might be able to answer more on the Lewis and Clark aspect. But his book seems to suggest as you get into evergreens and high altitudes and latitudes, it's not as efficient. It's also possible that I don't know if they went less or not, if they traveled less or not. I mean, I have heard stories where Indians from British Columbia came to this county in the 1800s. Could you substantiate it? Probably not. But, according to Native Americans in the spiritual sense, they've made that case to me. So, I mean, is it plausible? How far could people come to this area? I think is quite extensive. I would even point out like the Shawnee Tecumseh. I mean, when you look at his travels and the athleticism he must have had to go from, you know, probably what some say is Mississippi, Alabama. He, I think, died in Canada during the War of 1812, if that's what you want to call it. And he clearly would have had to come to Wisconsin. And by 1810, this area where I'm talking from today is the holding line. So he would have had to have left Indiana. And that only takes, with trail marker trees, with an athletic man, you know, I mean, for example, real evidence, I was reading a document on a Roman Catholic priest in my township in 1840 that they said he traveled 30 miles a day from house to house. And no offense, I think probably a Native American who has traveled the woodlands is probably even a little bit more athletic. I mean, I wish we would know that. I mean, I've backpacked a little, but good backpackers on Isle Royale, they were doing 25 miles a day. They could do that back and forth, the whole spine. So in that context, to go from 220 miles away, maybe in lower Indiana to here, could be done in somewhere between 8 and probably 30 days, but probably closer to 15 fairly. That's not unreasonable. And also very important to understand, particularly for those of you who are so interested in the West, Western tribes needed to figure out what the white man was doing, and particularly after Lewis and Clark, how they were destroying the woods and the fields and the industry that was coming. The way you would find that out if you were a Western tribe and that scuttle was all coming back, those rumors, you would go east. And I do believe that would be the case, okay? So, yeah. Michael, thanks for the suggestion. I appreciate that very much. Yeah.
Lou, can you enable my video? I want to show something.
I'll see if I can.
Laura, the one talking, is from Indiana.
Oh.
Portage, right up, under south of Lake Michigan, close to the dunes area.
Oh, yeah. I've been
There you go.
Okay, so your talk was very interesting. My boyfriend owned a tree service, a successful one for many years, and they kept passing this very large tree in Lake County, Indiana. And
Okay.
it was 400 to 500 years old, 6 feet in diameter. And he volunteered to trim it and feed it, do a deep root feeding. TV crew was there. It made the Tree Care Industry magazine. So this is a picture of the tree.
Oh,
In 2008. I wonder if that's the tree you heard about. It has since died. It's on a busy road. You can't miss it.
have they kept it standing?
What?
Have they kept it standing since its death?
No, it,
Yeah. Okay.
it fell apart.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That is not the tree I'm thinking of. I'm
Okay.
not going, but thank you for sharing. That's one of those things where, how do I say this? I know this is subjective, so you're not going to offend me if you don't believe this, any of the audience, but, and thank you again for sharing that. But like some trees, how do I say this? It's like they have like almost a living spirit is the argument. And so sometimes too, for Native Americans, living or dead, the oldest trees are the most special in an area. And one Native American told me, and this was so pretty, like I was thinking like, oh, it's going to be my old ash tree in the woods. And they're like, no, it's the Aspen Grove, because the Aspen Grove has shoots, and that is your grandmother of the forest, the grandmother spirit of the forest. So just for argumentative sake, we have to be careful sometimes of what is a special tree. And I, without a doubt, just looking at that tree that lived that long, that's beautiful because of the stories that it knew and what it held. And it may have been a pivotal meeting ground. Sadly, for example, I was told that one potential trail marker tree were often close to caves. So once the farmers in this certain area of Fond du Lac County destroyed the caves and blew them up with dynamite, they of course also were so insensitive that they destroyed a trail marker tree. I don't have this in my presentation, but I have bought a postcard out of Pennsylvania where actually they're talking about Old Indian Cave, and that's what it's called in Pennsylvania. When you look at that cave, you can see a tree that is strangely bent like a triangle where the leader still existed, but one came off pointing one way and the other tree next to it was pointing the other way, similarly trimmed with significant knobbing, like things where it had been cut or healed over. And so all I'm saying is all trees, have value. And we kind of live in a world where sometimes we, I think, have destroyed a lot of our forests to the point where even kids don't understand, like the forest that they're looking at isn't old growth. So that's why I mentioned the Ripon signal oak in the presentation. Like that still may be a significant tree because it lives so long. And for some reason, people knew not to cut it because it's very tempting to do that. So it'd be interesting if they could find more. I also wanted to point out, as you had suggested with that tree care industry book, it's $1 million question whether the tree markers, like the first tree that I showed you that has the clear bend in this county, that woods was timbered 2 or 3 times. And so it would be fascinating if there are people who have cut down for companies in various states that they actually did know. There's one argument that, oh my gosh, it was a miracle that the trail marker tree survived and it wasn't cut. But then there's also the argument that some of these people knew, or because of the bend, the tree was inefficient for lumbering. So it's really remarkable that some of these trees, though, had lasted. So. Oh, okay. James asked a question. I have read that trees can communicate with other trees. Do you believe that, and can you elaborate? This gets into more of a religious belief. So again, I always respect other people's religions. So I just don't want you to make fun of me. But in general, yes, I do believe trees can communicate. And I also think sometimes too, because Native Americans respect the environment, and the environment is so under threat right now, that in general, those sacred spots even can communicate. I have also witnessed people who are aligned with Native American spiritualism read inanimate objects. So I think anything is on the table. So yes. So again, you don't have to believe that. I have tried to give you stuff that's pretty sounder evidence and out of that. But yes, James, I have not read that, but many people, after I talk about trees, point out some of those books, but I have not read them. But I do believe too, like examples, James, along that line, the Aspen Groves are so important because people around, I don't think really value the aspen. It grows really quick. The trees fall over, but the roots are all together. So understand that an aspen grove, if you got some land in old untouched woods, and yes, they're only like, the trees are 1 foot wide, they're 6 inches wide and they shoot up. But those aspen groves are so important because they know the history of the land, probably even to some extent, people argue before Indians were here. Because some of those groves, I think, can be 10,000 years old. I'm thinking of the Trees of Wisconsin book, which they probably made a Trees of Minnesota, Trees of Iowa book, but I can't think of the author right now. So, but yes, I do believe that. Unfortunately, most people don't believe that, which explains why they are ruined. There's a Native American, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm probably ruining the quote. He said, that which we don't know, we often hate. And that which we hate, we often destroy. Largely, many of these trees were destroyed because they were for savages. The Indians were going to come back. And that's a struggle for me. I'm a guy that's German and Irish and Bohemian. And I spent a lot of the 7 years of my research, the first half, like oh, these farmers came here and what a story. And then it gets tricky because some of them rarely respected Indians, and some of them, I think, intentionally took care of that problem. And so that leads to a lot of moral questions that often makes people uncomfortable. And that's usually not kept in textbooks or on mainstream media because I'm paraphrasing my dissertation, but when you get into controversy and moral thought, it doesn't sell. So when you look at media and what is, and we're talking history here, we do feel good stories that really just are kind of like sports watching. We can watch the Bengals tomorrow, and I will, okay, but that's not controversial. That's I'll write about it someday, but you try to figure out the right words to say it, because we want people to listen to us, because I'm assuming many of you are part of this organization because you care about history, but also there's that nostalgia with Lewis and Clark. I mean, the saddest thing about that Ken Burns documentary is that really it invited the ruining of the West. I think in long term, that's exactly what happened. Leo, who I was talking about in Shawano, a man that I've been interviewing that knew a bunch of Native American artists up in Canada. He was talking to a Native American 40 years ago in Northern Canada, probably the Northwest Territory. And he said, we were fine up here until money came. And so once gold got discovered and things like that, which is really what the Lewis and Clark expedition brings, is consumption to the West. And in a weird way, industry. I mean, even arguably fur trading became an industry. Once you make animals an industry or trees an industry, they run the risk of being for profit. And if not managed, you will eliminate the species. And we saw that with the wolf in the lower 48. I would argue, I believe, based on who I've talked to with Native Americans, wolverines were down here, all riding the lower Great Lakes sparingly, but 400 years ago, yes. But that's the animal they're first going to kill when you're a fur trapper, because wolverines raid traps. And so eventually nowadays people think, oh, that's just something maybe in the northern UP or in Saskatchewan, when in reality, they did have a farther territory. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I'm seeing more questions, and maybe the manager can help me out. I'll stay on as long as people peel off. You don't have another meeting, right?
No.
So if people peel off, I'm not offended, but I will hang on and answer any questions if you'd like. So sorry. Thanks for listening. And I do have my email attached, and I teach at Oakfield High School. So if you reach out to me, you would be able to find me and contact me. And I'd be glad to explain anything else I can.
Thank you so much, Karl, for this really enlightening talk. Lou, I think we have completed what we wanted to do, unless someone else has a quick chat time here.
Okay. I personally have to get going, and I'm going to be shutting the meeting down. So
no, that's okay. Sorry,
yeah,
sorry if I talked too long.
No, you didn't. You didn't at all. No, it was very good. I echo Mary's comments. It was wonderful, and I appreciate you took the time to talk to us today. And I know we were all enlightened by what you had to say. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. I think with that, I think we'll end this session here, and I thank everyone for coming. I hope you similarly enjoyed it the way I did and Mary did, and we will have other types of presentations in the future once we figure out who we're going to have and when we're going to have them. But we'll get there. And if you've got any ideas, please pass them along to Mary, or to Laura, or to me, and we will pursue things that will be of interest to you. So thank you all. Mary, do you have any further words?
No, but stay tuned for finding out when our next meeting is and whether it's Zoom or in person.
Right. Okay,
thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Could I just take a picture of this, because then I can know the questions if they asked?